And now we have a special fireside chat with Ms. Carrie Stokes, who's an AGS Councilor and the Chief Geographer at USAID, as well as Mr. David Yarnold, the former CEO of the Audubon Society. Carrie and David.
So good afternoon, everyone. As John just mentioned, I'm Carrie Stokes, and I'm the Chief Geographer at the U.S. Agency for International Development. I'm based in Washington, D.C. A few months ago, I was in California for a conference, and the conference was focused on GIS. And I had gotten there early, was sitting in the front row, waiting for the plenary to begin, and I sat down next to a gentleman and started a little chit-chat while waiting for the plenary to start. So I leaned over and I said, "What brings you to this conference?" And he said, "Well, I used to be the CEO of the National Audubon Society, and I used GIS to help transform the operations of the organization. And prior to that, I had been a journalist. So when I stepped down from the National Audubon Society, I decided to write a book." Well, at that moment, the host of the conference gathered everybody's attention in the audience, and we focused on the agenda that he was explaining of what was to come the following week. In his remarks about the agenda, he mentioned that during the week, a special book would be released. The title was The Geography of Hope. I was moved by that title. And so I leaned over to my newfound seatmate and said, "Wow, that's a great title. I'm gonna have to look that book up." And he leaned back to me and he said, "That's my book." So today I have the great pleasure to introduce you to David Yarnold, the author of the book. I did, in fact, read it. I was inspired by it, and today I have the opportunity to talk about that book with you. So David, let's dive in. You have a chapter called Risky Business. It's about the insurance industry. With the damage from hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, and floods becoming more frequent and expensive, it's really no surprise that the insurance companies are sensitive to a changing climate. In your research, what was surprising to you to learn about how GIS is being used by the insurance industry?
Thanks for that, Carrie, and thank you for the invitation. Let me take a quick step back. I'm not like the other speakers today. I'm sorry I don't have any complicated slides with lots of data on them. I wrote this book for you, for GIS practitioners, so that we could tell the stories to the general public about how people are changing the world using GIS. One of the things I hear most frequently from GIS people is nobody understands what I do. Like my significant other, my family, nobody gets what I do. And I said, well, that's because we don't tell stories about how people are using it. And so there's 9 very different chapters in the book. And the one about insurance is used as an umbrella to talk about businesses as a whole. And the insurance industry has mapped virtually every inch of the continental United States and Hawaii. They know whether you have a trampoline in your backyard. They know if you've got a swimming pool. They know the condition of your roof. They know, and it is both transforming the industry and creating chaos in the marketplace. So I flew with one of the teams, and what they fly in is there's a fleet of 42 of these planes, and there's a camera in the belly of a twin-engine Cessna, and it takes everything from infrared images like this to 3D images, and what they come away with is an amazing amount of knowledge about where we live and what we do, and that technology is saving money for companies in extraordinary ways. One of the main members of Lloyd's of London told me that in doing claims, they've been able to bring their costs down in some disaster areas from $13,000 per house to $8. But what this means is that in any given neighborhood, insurers are about to be able to cherry pick which houses on which streets, never mind which communities or which zip codes. And what that's going to do is it's going to cause a huge disruption in how insurance gets paid for. So in California, in Florida, there are big fights right now about whether insurers are going to stay in place. And the things in California, the two things the insurance industry wants in California, the heart of the fight there, number one, they want to use models. They want to use GIS models to set rates. And two, they want to build in the cost of reinsurance. So GIS is at the heart of how that very big industry is changing. The chapter ends with a small profile of a startup in Palo Alto, at which, between the time I interviewed the principals in summer of 23 and when the book went to bed at the end of February in 24, had been sold. So anybody who tells you that you can't make money in geography, they're wrong.
Amazing to think that our insurance industry can be transformed. One of the quotes from that chapter that really had struck me was one of the insurance experts who said he really wants to have people feel like their insurance company has their back and is there to help them in their greatest moments of need. And I thought that was pretty fascinating because I don't know about you, but that's not exactly what I think of when I think of my home insurance company.
He sent me a picture of him and his son. That's what he says he tells his son.
Amazing. Okay, so from the powerful insurance company that sees real financial value in using geospatial tools for their business, let's shift to biodiversity conservation. You have a chapter that focuses on biodiversity conservation in Africa against the backdrop of a changing climate. This chapter involves elephants and gorillas and something you call geodesign to better manage biodiversity. And there's also a quote that struck me in this chapter. It's from the CEO of the African Wildlife Foundation, who himself is an African. He said, "Imagine the French telling you how to run Yellowstone." Could you explain what he meant by that? And tell us how geodesign relates to human-wildlife conflict in local communities in Africa.
Thanks for that question. So every chapter represents a major segment of GIS users. And I wanted to do a chapter about conservation. And having worked in the conservation space for 15 years, I was looking for a fresh idea. And this idea of a post-colonial approach to conservation in Africa, for conservation for and by Africans, really got my attention. And what he meant by, imagine the French telling you how to run Yellowstone, is in conservation efforts in Africa, a whole lot of areas have been set aside to conserve, and 14 million indigenous people have been moved off those lands. So Africa has this massive task ahead of it. It has to do something that we've barely managed to do in some places in much richer worlds. And that is to develop and conserve at the same time. It's imperative for the world's biodiversity and for climate that we do that. 70% of the people in Africa are under 30. At the turn of the century, 4 out of every 10 people on the planet will be African. Africa has to develop and it has to conserve. And so that dual approach, which runs counter to what a lot of American conservation organizations promote, is what's taking root. For the first time in 2022, there was a gathering of the managers of protected areas from across Africa. First time, 2022. And they're using geodesign in a number of ways across Africa's many nations, including in Rwanda at Volcanoes National Park, which is the largest habitat for gorillas in that country. And they're expanding it by 25%, and they're doing that because ecotourism has been so successful. But they had to relocate several thousand Africans, of Rwandans, in the process. And one of the things they love pointing to is that it was an inclusive process that worked with the folks who had been on that land for a long time and are moving them to nearby villages with better education and more saleable crops. That's the promise. Actually moving people and having everybody buy in and making that last step of leaving behind a family home, that's a hard thing to do. But geodesign is a big piece of what's happening across Africa, and African Wildlife Foundation and others are at the forefront of that.
So I found that particularly inspiring given my own work in international development, and USAID has for many years promoted and supported biodiversity conservation in Africa and beyond. And one thing we've learned over 60 plus years of international development is that you've really got to involve local people in any solution that is designed to improve their lives. It doesn't make any sense for people on the other side of the world to be making decisions without the full context and the buy-in of the people who live there.
And this is Francis Nziokia. He's a great example. He's a farmer, and he has a plot of land that's adjacent to a conservancy, and he has bee boxes with bees, because elephants don't like bees, and they're furnished by the African Wildlife Foundation. He has bee boxes, and he's a conservationist, but elephants just love running through his property. And, we all look at elephants, most of the people in the West look at elephants and say charismatic, amazing, wonderful creatures. But as you know from on the ground, they can keep kids from going to school, they trample crops, they mess up transportation infrastructure. That's why you actually don't want the French telling you how to run Yellowstone.
And it's an interesting thing with the theme of our conference being cooperation and conflict in a changing climate, because this particular chapter kind of focused on the human-wildlife conflict, not necessarily the human-human conflict. So let's move from Africa to Eastern Europe. You opened your book with a chapter about the GIS team in the city of Prague, which is the historical capital of the Czech Republic. You write that you had heard about their work related to climate change, but you were blown away when you learned they were not just democratizing data, but they were democratizing democracy. How are the maps of Prague protecting democracy in Eastern Europe?
So I will answer that, but the Prague chapter was a huge surprise to me. Almost every chapter was a revelation. I found something different in every chapter than I expected to find. How many of you caught the news this week that the Biden administration has okayed the use of anti-personnel mines in Ukraine? Big deal. There's a chapter in the book about humanitarian demining, and so one of the things that's happened with the book and its chapters is that they've stayed in the news in a way that I didn't imagine. And the story that I didn't expect to find in the demining sector is a gender equity story. It was only 15 years ago that women were really allowed to work in that field. And now in some countries, they are the primary locators of mines and the deminers themselves. And in conflict zones where in some cultures where women can't talk to men who aren't their husbands or brothers, now there are women on the ground who are learning where those mines are. So it's just a way of saying these chapters have been in the news and stay in the news. In Prague, the Czech Republic is only 35 years past communism. It is famously corrupt. In fact, while I was doing the chapter on Prague, there was this major, like, mafia-like bust in the parliament where dozens of people were arrested for bribery. And the reason maps play such a big part in protecting democracy, protecting a fledgling democracy, is that it goes back to my journalism days. There's an old saying, it's all about transparency. That is the one-word answer, transparency. There's an old saying, and that is that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So if you're wanting to crime a lot, and you're wanting to corrupt a lot, having the public watching what you're doing and having maps that are available to the public makes it a whole lot harder to do that. And Prague's GIS team is 42 people. And they have maps that go back to, because Prague, as you may well know, is a medieval city. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is also a fast-growing, hot, very hip, modern city. And somehow marrying those things up, preserving the old while planning the new, that is actually like a participant sport in Prague. They have this facility called Camp. It's a big, giant convening center, and they have a 100-yard long screen, and they regularly display plans that are in process for building a new Prague. And they had 50,000 people come through there last year. And we're doing an event there, a full-day event about GIS on December 12th. And so the transparency piece is, it's a public good, and it's GIS, not in theory, not as a research paper, but as a way to figure out, where do we need more pediatricians? Where should the next transit stop be? How do we route traffic in a city with cobblestone streets? It's a very real application of GIS, as are all of the stories in the book.
Thank you. So I've got one more question for you. You named the book The Geography of Hope, and that certainly got my attention. What makes you optimistic after all the research you've done, the interviews you've had, and the prior work that you did even before the book?
As a veteran of climate legislation work for 15 years, I worked 5.5 years at Environmental Defense Fund, 11 years at Audubon. There was a moment after the House passed the cap and trade bill in 2008 where we were this close to having a Senate version of that bill, and we would have had climate legislation in the US. And I was in a box with a senator, a box at the baseball game, with a senator who said, a Republican who said, I can't do this and immigration. And the leader of the Senate decided to do immigration. So I was there at the moment where we fell short. And that's a deep, long-lasting wound. So where I find hope now, Carrie, is in education and new technologies. And so that's why the last chapter in the book is about K-12 education. I really wanted to write about broad-scale GIS being taught. And I could only find 2 places in the world where that was happening. And so I went to England, and that's where most of this chapter comes from, because it's compulsory there. So before we wrap up, I'll tell you there are a very limited number of copies of the books available for sale. There's a special student discount. I'm happy to sign them. And what I'm really humbled by is the people who have said to me, first of all, they've said, this is a really heavy book, thank God it's a lot of pictures. But they've also said, I feel like I've been seen. And that's what the GIS folks have told me.
So I will add yet another plug for the book, having now read it twice and been inspired each time. I think we're at a point in this in our country's history where inspiration is needed and hope for the future, and recognizing that much rests with all of us in this room, but of course the young people as well. So I also want to say thank you to all of the teachers of geography who are here. You are leading the next generation, and I hope you have an opportunity to read this book and inspire your own students. Thank you.
Thank you.